Hello and welcome to the Well Project Leadership Exchange. My name is Marissa Gonzalez and I am a community advisory board member with the Well Project. I joined in 2021 and I'm so excited to be here with our guest today, Miss Grissel. Grissel, thank you so much for your time. Can you introduce yourself for our viewers?
Yeah, hi. My name is Grissel Granados. I am the new Deputy Director at the Well Project, and I'm really excited to be here and to be in this conversation with you.
That is so amazing. Congratulations on the new journey. I've been very excited to have a conversation with you, and just the fact that you're now on board makes it all that more amazing. But again, thank you so much for being here. I really wanted to do a deep dive, if you will, with you, but I want to get to know you a little bit better because I know a little bit about you professionally and some of the things that you've accomplished in your career, but I want to get to know you on a personal level. So can you tell me a little bit about where you're from, where you grew up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born in Mexico City, in Mexico, and I migrated to Los Angeles, California with my family when I was 5 years old. And I've been here since then. I'm a California girl through and through. I'm still in LA. And I have a young child who is about to be 3 years old.
Oh, I love that, a mom. And I love that you said California girl through and through. I
Yes,
love that.
absolutely.
I don't know much about California girls, but I'm excited to learn. So how did you get started in HIV advocacy? I'm always interested to hear how people got connected to the mission before we get into how you got connected with the Well Project.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very personal to me. I myself am a woman living with HIV, and so I ended up acquiring HIV really at birth through breastfeeding. So my mom, when she was pregnant with me, got something that is very common in my family, which is preeclampsia, and ended up needing an emergency C-section. She hemorrhaged and ended up needing a blood transfusion. And so this was back in 1986 in Mexico before they were really testing the blood supply. And so that's how she acquired HIV. And then immediately after, I acquired HIV through breastfeeding. Neither of us really knew about our status until my dad was actually the one who started getting sick about 5 years later. He's the one who started getting sick, and at the time, because he was not a gay man, he did not use drugs. They didn't really know what was happening with him, and it was really like honestly almost at the end where they found out that it was HIV. They decided to test him for HIV, and that's what it was. But unfortunately, by that time, he was already too ill. So he did end up passing away shortly after his diagnosis. And my mom was diagnosed at the same time while she was pregnant with my younger sister. So shortly after my dad's death, we came to Los Angeles because we already had some family here. And I ended up getting diagnosed here in Los Angeles at the age of 5. So I've grown up knowing about my status since I was 5. Really, when my mom found out, I found out, which I consider to be really one of the best things that my mom could have done for my experience, was that I got to know about my status before I even knew what stigma was, before I knew any of the negative kind of like associations to do with it. I just knew that I had HIV and my mom had HIV, and we were just us, and so I'm very grateful for my mom having that approach with me. So I grew up right, kind of like knowing my status, and I started doing public speaking when I was 12. And really I think that was really my introduction to it. My mom started working in the HIV field. And so I was also always just like around, and it was always something that was part of my life, aside from like my personal life, taking medications and going to the doctor and that kind of stuff. Like I was very much involved through my mom, as a child. But then, when I went to college, I didn't really want to think about it too much. I didn't want to, I was like, I'm just here for college. I even took a medication break all 4 years of college because I was like, I don't want this to be part of my experience. So in partnership with my doctor at the time, we're like, yeah, this makes sense. Let's try it out. Let's see what happens. So I really felt like I'm compartmentalizing this phase of my life right now. And I don't want to have to think about HIV. Of course, there were so many other instances in which I had to think about it, but at least for that, I wanted some kind of separation, honestly. And even when I was thinking through, like, what do I want to do when I grow up professionally? I didn't think I wanted to work in the HIV field, precisely because I felt like it feels too obvious. It feels I'm going to get pigeonholed into this just because it's my experience. But because I ended up going to college in Central California, which is mostly suburban and even some rural areas, there really weren't as many services for people living with HIV as there were in Los Angeles. And so I think that's kind of when I started to see like, oh, not everyone has the experience that I had, like growing up in Los Angeles, feeling like I had a lot of resources, a lot of support, right? Like all of these like large networks. And so then I started to think about it more so about like HIV outside of myself and how does it impact other people and how can I help other people? And so then that's kind of when I was like, okay, yeah, I would like to do this, right? And so I went to grad school for social work, knowing in my mind that I wanted to work in the HIV field professionally. So that's kind of how I got into it professionally, but then also just, like some of the ties I had in advocacy, even like as a younger child, and kind of like since then have been involved in a lot of different things, both like in a more like traditional kind of, like administrative way, but then also definitely being involved with some more grassroots organizations doing like advocacy, and more kind of like focused and driven by people living with HIV. So long story short story long, actually. That's kind of my journey to this.
I think that is so beautiful. And you touched on so many things that I would like to dive a little deeper into, because our stories are very different. Like you said, you migrated here from Mexico. You learned about your diagnosis with your mom at, you said, the age of 5, correct?
Yeah.
So learning early on, what was that? I'm interested to hear more about what that transition was like, but I think it's also important to highlight for, anyone that's watching this, is that our stories are different. While we are both Latina women, you were diagnosed at a young age. I was diagnosed at the age of 26. You grew up learning about HIV, where you were able to kind of combat stigma early on. Whereas in my experience, we didn't talk about these things in my family. And after my diagnosis is when I personally learned that I actually had a second cousin who passed away from AIDS-related complications, but yet our family still didn't talk about it. And even after being diagnosed, having dealt with the family stigma, the internal stigma. So I think it's really important for people to see that there's no face and there's no one picture and there's no one story. So I think it's really beautiful that you were able to use it in a positive way, because I think sometimes people kind of hear it or they see it and life experiences cause them to how they're going to react to the news, such as receiving an HIV diagnosis. But I would like to dive deeper, being a Mexican woman and having moved to the States and finding out about your diagnosis. When it comes to the Latin community, how do you feel that your experience has either helped or harmed the way that you address those in our Hispanic community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think for me, how my culture has influenced my experience, I think for me, like from my experience, it's really been it's drawing on one of the strengths of our culture, which is, right, like these like tight-knit family bonds, right, which, you know, can come with good and bad, but for me it ended up being good, because when we moved here, like we moved with my extended family. So my mom like comes from a large family. She has like 8 brothers and sisters. And so then like we came here and we were with all of my aunts and uncles and cousins and all of that, and everybody knew. And so I felt like I grew up feeling that support of my extended family. Right. So if there were times when, you know, I ended up in the hospital, whether it was for chickenpox or cancer, it was my extended family who was supporting my mom. And even and to me, it's not a small thing, because this was in the 90s, right? Kind of like there's still stigma today, but stigma in the 90s was even more intensified, right? Like that is definitely when it was much more common for people to say, like, you need to use a different restroom. We don't want you using our dishes. We don't want to eat together. You can't sleep here. Let me disinfect everything. Like all of that. Like almost very like March 2020 COVID times, right? Like it was definitely very reminiscent of that time. But I did not experience that with my family. And so I felt like for me, it was a resource. So I think it's, you know, like with the Latinx community, it's we're not monolithic at all. And right, like I think like religion plays a big part of it. I think, right, like machismo can play a big part of it, but then also these like strong familial ties play a big part of it. And so I think for some, it might seem that like, oh, Latinos are very conservative, very close-minded, you know, like people will automatically lose their families. But for others, that's not the case, right? I know of a lot of people who are Latinos, and even if their families might, you know, have a really hard time talking about HIV, or for queer communities, you know, kind of like being accepting of their queer identities, they still somehow end up being like financially responsible for their family, and, you know, kind of like still expected to follow through with their family roles and whatever that might be. So it's this balance between what is the role that family plays into your journey. So yeah, I think it's going to be different. It's going to be different across the board in terms of like how people's culture really plays into their thoughts and their ideas about what it's like to have HIV or to have a family member who has HIV.
Right. And how do you feel that that's been able to translate? Have you, throughout your advocacy and the work that you've done in the HIV field, have you done testing? And because I know you said you went for social work as well for college. So how do you feel, or how did you find that, you know, individuals reciprocated or did not reciprocate to testing, to the information, to being educated on it, or even just being open to the conversation about knowing what the numbers are and what the statistics are, and somebody in your own family could have this? Are you really, you know, leading a life where they can feel comfortable sharing that information with you? Because I think being able to use our voices and share our stories is so important, because so many don't, and that is one of the biggest reasons that stigma still does exist.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, so I did start as a tester over a decade ago. I did start as a tester and did test a lot of young Latinos. And, you know, I think so then there's that intersection, right, of being a young queer person most of the time, and then coming in and yeah, and right, so we would have some of these conversations about families, about their own risk perceptions, right? Like, so for folks who might not be as familiar with like the epidemic among Latinx communities, is that like we're often diagnosed very late. And I think the reason is that kind of like people don't consider themselves, like they don't think this impacts them, right? So they're like, oh yes, I know what it is. That's either like it's a white disease or it's a gay disease or whatever that might be, right? And so in the Latinx community, because it's not always talked about as openly, people just assume that it's not going to impact them, that it's not going to be part of their story, and so they wait much longer to go and get tested. I think part of the issue in terms of when organizations or like government entities try to like have, whether it's campaigns or interventions or anything like that with the Latinx community, is again, right, the fact that we're not a monolith. Like I think our immigration, like our proximity to immigration, is also a big thing, right? So whether like it's so different to be a young immigrant like myself versus somebody who migrated as an adult versus somebody who was born here, or somebody who's a third generation and their connection to their Latinidad might be different, right? Like very different. And like what their culture is different based on your proximity to immigration. So it's really hard to have a one size fits all, like even way of like reaching the Latinx community. Right, because some people might be like, oh, the solution is just put everything in Spanish, but then there's a lot of Latinos who don't speak Spanish, right? Or we speak different dialects of Spanish, right? Like depending on what country we're from, or even what region of our country we're from. And so I think like from a provider standpoint, it's not kind of like an easy one size fits all approach. And so we need to continue to one, think of all of those like subpopulations within the Latinx community, and have things that are specific for them, depending on kind of like what their experiences are. What do you feel like it's been like kind of like where you're at, and what do you feel like it's been your experience in talking to other Latinx people?
Yeah, I think, you hit it right on the head, being, having the different countries and the different dialects and even just the different areas here throughout the United States plays, I think, a huge part in how receptive people are to information about being tested or just knowing about HIV and the existence of it, and how it's really elevated since, it was first brought into existence. So I think for me personally, being in the area that I'm in, and it's funny because I was just having this conversation with someone yesterday who actually works at a pharmacy that has like this program of excellence for individuals living with HIV, that one of the local clinics here served about 1,200 patients. And when I was having a conversation to just try to figure out how to bridge a gap, if you will, what can we do? How many people, even just from the clinic standpoint that this specific clinic is serving, how many people are actually open in public with their store, or open and sharing their information? And they said, well, can we count you in that number? I'm like, yeah, sure. They said probably 5. And, I think it just speaks to, like you said, a lot of Latinos get diagnosed later in life because of, all of the misconceptions that it can't happen to Latin women or straight men, or, whatever those misconceptions are. And I was doing a little bit of research, and I came across one statistic that caught my eye that stated that while Latinos are about 1/5 of the US population living with HIV, we make up 26%.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I thought that spoke volumes because, there's a gap somewhere. And, I think the biggest thing, like you said, was being able to know that there are different dialects. It's not as simple as just create something in Spanish because maybe it's not their dialect of Spanish, or maybe they don't speak Spanish. So I really think, and I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on some innovative ideas, maybe, or some different ways that, if we have other partners watching this that are having, similar difficulties in their area where they feel like we don't know how to reach the Latin population, what are the best ways to do it? And obviously we're not going to come up with the perfect answer today. And knowing that there's different subpopulations, where do you reach the younger generation versus reaching the older generation? And with the older generation, are they open to these types of conversations? But I would love to hear, what are some of your thoughts, or if there's something that throughout your career, because you said it's been over a decade, has there been anything specific that you found that has worked?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to do also with, right, thinking of all of the different intersections that that we experience, because then I also think about, right, kind of like we've been talking about, like how different the Latinx community can be based on like what country you're from, where kind of like where in the country you live, and all of that kind of stuff, and also even, right, like I also think about anti-Blackness, right? And just kind of how often like Black Latinos are missed, right? Kind of like we might have campaigns that that are for Latinos, but it's usually people who are probably our skin tones, right? And Black Latinos might not see themselves in that. And then same thing, right? Kind of like there might be campaigns for Black folks, but they don't acknowledge that there are Black Latinos, right? And so like I'm thinking of like that as an example of an intersection that is often ignored, right? Because of all of the ways in which Black erasure happens in the Latinx community. But then I also think about, right, so yeah, like different age groups, being able to be specific to like what are the unique needs, what are things that are actually going to interest them and make them open and feel safe to have some of these conversations. So I think about, right, like one of the models that I know has been tried, and I think really where people have pulled from is like the Promotora Model, right? Like in that really started with having women teach each other about birth control, and how some providers have tried doing that as well with HIV, right? And being able to do that because it pulls on like the culture, right? The culture of like you get together with your friends, and you're there in el chisme, and you're there, right, kind of like talking about life, whether it's like discussing, right, the like novelas, and being able to pull from what you're seeing on TV and bringing that into your life, right? Kind of like it really, that's really kind of how we do learning, right? It's also a lot of like storytelling that comes from that, right? And sharing experiences, and even if it comes off as like gossip, like chisme, like it's also like, no, that's totally the way that that our people learn. Sometimes it's like, oh, well, let me tell you about what happened to my friend. And then you get into a deep conversation of like, well, that's why we need to think about that, and things like that. So I feel like that's kind of one unique way of reaching communities that might not be the same as like, here's a pamphlet, or, here's a doctor who you should listen to, or whatever it is. And it's really those more kind of like personal relationships that you need to build trust with to really have some of these intimate conversations, and really share about yourself, and kind of like what you're doing, what you think about it, how you feel about it, like all of that kind of stuff.
Right. And I think, you said it perfectly. A lot of times, if it's not a direct connection to us, we don't pay attention to it. So even just being able to equate it to, like you said, a novela or something that is very common within the culture that can allow for a deeper conversation. I like that. That gives me some ideas that we might have to put together, like a mini series of like a telenovela kind of thing. I love that. But we're both millennials. Have you found that there's been any specific approach personally that has been successful, or really just engaging in those one-on-one conversations?
For me, I think it's a lot of engaging in one-on-one conversations. But I also think about, right, like like community, right? I think it's being able to have these spaces where it can be normalized, like in a community, right? And so being able to create these opportunities for people to meet each other so that they can have somebody else to exchange stories with, right? And so I think the community piece is the big thing, because it often comes to like needing that support, right? And so like we're saying, like not everybody's family is going to be accepting, and so you need to find your chosen family that you do feel comfortable having those conversations with, that or even if you do have a close relationship with your family, right, that might not be the conversation that you want to have with them. So just like the need for creating these larger supportive communities, I think is really important. And I think that's important at any age, right? I think that's important at any age. I think it's true for older people as it is for younger people. I also think, right, like when it comes to young people, it's also about listening to their ideas and right, like we always talk about, like we're the experts like in our own lives, right? And so especially as people living with HIV, right, it's regardless of whether there's letters behind your name or not, like you're an expert in this because you're living through it. And so I think we need to also continue to give that idea power, and particularly with young people whose voices often go ignored, because people just assume like they don't know better. But I think the answers and the approaches really need to come from the community itself.
And I appreciate the fact that, you touched on being able to find the tribe in the community and your chosen family. Having been diagnosed later in life at 26, I didn't know anybody else that was living with HIV aside from the person that I contracted it from. So, even having things, the Well Project is a prime example of finding your tribe and finding your chosen family, because if it weren't for groups and organizations such as the Well Project, I can't say where I would be today. I don't know that you and I would have crossed paths. And I'm a firm believer in, everything happens for a reason. The timing of things happen when they need to happen, but being able to just know that while you may have family or friends or, community that may not have the same lived experience as you, does exist, but to be able to have that community that has those lived experiences can go so much further, because now there's a deeper level of connection, there's a deeper level of conversation, and there's a deeper level of comfortability in expressing yourself. Because I think often that's the biggest thing, is as someone living with HIV, you often don't know who you can talk to. Even talking to a provider sometimes can feel a little off-putting, or it can feel intimidating, because maybe, the provider doesn't have the same lived experience, or, sometimes we have a greater respect for people that have that lived experience, because we can feel like, okay, this person knows what I've been through. And there is power in being able to share a story and being able to share in commonalities, but also growing from those commonalities as well. I would love to know, because you've been in this field for so long, both personally and professionally, what is the greatest thing that you're proud of?
What is the greatest thing I'm proud of? I mean, I think professionally, I mean, I don't know that I can pinpoint one thing, but I really enjoyed my time working with young people in the capacity that I did, because my role was always more like administrative. I felt really special in being able to work closely with our community advisory board where I was at before, and so that was definitely one of the selling points of the Well Project. It was like a selling point that I was like, they have a CAB, perfect, because again, right, like I strongly believe that the solutions need to come from, right, like really being led by the people who are directly impacted, and so for me, it was that, and being able to partner with young people and be witness to their brilliance, right? And being able to just support them in implementing their ideas and taking what they said and thinking through like, okay, so right, like these are their thoughts. How do I apply like my skills and my knowledge to elevate what they're saying, and follow through on what they want to see happen. So I feel like for me, that's been probably one of the most rewarding things is working with a youth cab. And so I really look forward to yeah, like just working closely with the Well Projects cab as well, including you, because I truly believe there is so much power in that, right? Kind of having the people directly impacted really drive the solutions, as well as organizations that are funded to right, to make change in this field. Like really still needs to be driven. Decision making needs to be driven by people who are directly impacted. So I'm excited for that.
Yes, I can definitely second a lot of that. Is there anything that you've done? So like if we have somebody watching who, whether they were diagnosed at 5 or diagnosed at 26 and maybe isn't using their voice, but has considered using their voice or is thinking of maybe ways that they can do something to feel like they're impacting their community, if they're not quite ready to, put it on a display, if you will. Was there any projects that you did before actually getting into the professional side of things that you did personally, like a passion project, if you will, just, because that in itself can help individuals feel, okay, let me start to wet my feet a little bit before I dive into full on a 9-to-5 business or a 9-to-5 working for a HIV organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like I started doing that like health education since I was a teenager, right? Like with my friends, right? Because I knew something that they didn't know, right? And so I remember very clearly when I think I was maybe like in 7th grade, and was probably the first time I shared with people at school, because my friends in 7th grade were already starting to talk about sex, and so I was like, oh, okay, I have all of these like sexual health like information that I should be sharing with them, right? And so I felt like it started even from that, right? Just kind of like what are those conversations that I could be having one-on-one with people. And for me, and that was the first time that I shared my HIV status with someone at school. And it was because I felt like I was doing it to help somebody else, right? Because they were like, oh, you can't tell that like, your potential sexual partner will have HIV. And so I was like, well, does it look like I have HIV? Right. And so, right, like I really used that was the first time that I used my experience to teach somebody else something. And I felt empowered to do that on my own, right? And then from there, right, like I said, like in college, I really did want some kind of separation from like my own experience living with HIV, but I knew, right, kind of since I was a teenager that I had a passion for sexual health. So I joined like a peer sex education group and kind of like got into it that way. And so I felt like, even though I wasn't really tapping into like telling everybody my HIV status, like in college, I still felt like I was contributing and doing my part, right, for my college community, right? And so I felt like that was a way of getting involved, right? Even if I wasn't using my status during that period of time to educate others, right? And so I think of right, there are a lot of opportunities to get involved, even if you're not comfortable sharing your status publicly, right? Like maybe you're only comfortable sharing it with other people who also have HIV, and that's perfectly fine, right? Like I think the decision to share like personal information like publicly and widely is a personal choice, right? I think now with social media, right, like it feels really easy to have a platform to share very intimate information publicly, but we don't have to, right? Like I knew, even, I feel like I've always known, and I felt like I definitely exercised this even more in college. I'm like, I don't owe my story to anybody. And I feel that way to this day, right? Like I don't owe my story to anyone. I'm very open, but I also know that I have a choice of when I share that with people and when I don't, right? Like I can definitely go about my life kind of having relationships with people, right? Kind of like whether it's a new friendship or it's, right, like whatever it is, and never feel the need to share my status, because that is not everything about me, right? And so I would say that people really should be able to navigate spaces, including HIV spaces, kind of like at their own comfort level, right? And so not feeling like pushed or rushed to share what they don't want to share, and that doesn't mean that they don't have the right to show up to these spaces and hear what's happening, and contribute what they want to contribute, right? So I think the impact that people can make can be at an individual level, just kind of, again, sharing with somebody, like being able to share what you know with somebody else, or it could be in a large public platform, right, where you're sharing what you know with a lot more people. I think it still has that same impact of feeling like you're doing something for somebody else, right, and that you're doing it with that positive intent. So yeah.
I know that we could probably go on this conversation for hours, but I feel like that was so beautifully put. Like, I feel like that is a perfect way to wrap up our conversation, because it was just authentic, it was real, it was genuine. And I mean, I don't think we could get more truthful than that. Being able to stand in your truth, whatever it looks like, you having the decisions over how widely or not widely you share your story, but knowing that you have the freedom to show up in the spaces regardless if you're open with your status or not. I absolutely love that. So Grissel, I thank you so much for this. Like I said, I know we could probably talk for hours, but I appreciate your time so much and just being able to learn a little bit more about you. Did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to share with our viewers?
No, just, thank you so much for doing this. It was great, just, yeah, being able to hear about some of your experiences as well, right? Even though they're different, like there's always some kind of connection. And so I think that's the parting thought, is that, right? Like even with people who have had like different life stories, like to be able to find those pieces that we can connect to each other and see how our experiences in the grand scheme of things are maybe not as different. So thank you. Thanks for having this chat today.
I love that. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.